Buckeye Nation, welcome to another edition of the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network. I'm your host, Shannon Sommers, director of the Ozone Radio Network, contributor at Hayes and Cannon, and producer of Across the Field with Tony Gerdeman. Today we're going to be talking about the Buckeyes men's basketball team. So naturally for that, I have Eric at the BBC joining us. Eric, how are we doing today?
Doing pretty good. And Andrew Dockage, you are a badass. You keep it up, sir.
Hey, if he keeps hitting shots from the parking lot, maybe somebody will pay for his dad's parking.
Excuse me, he didn't hit that from the parking lot. He hit it from Ashtabula, Ohio.
Yeah.
And if you doubt that, go back and look at the video and look where he's standing on the floor. His left foot is on Ashtabula, Ohio.
It's funny. It's funny because when we recorded Across the Field, and Tom Moore was like, I haven't gotten excited about Ohio State because I was in the press box for the football game, so you can't get excited in there. He's like, and I'm on the couch, and all of a sudden I'm like yelling and jumping up. And I was like, hey, when you hit that, and I think I scared all the cats and everything. So
I scared my wife. She was upstairs and had no idea what was going on. It was the first time I've ever, in the last 3 or 4 years, gotten that animated about hitting a basket. I mean, dropping that one and going up 12 against Michigan State going into the half was huge. So huge. And hey, it's the only 3 points he scored, but I think those are the 3 biggest points in the game because that gave him so much momentum coming out into the second half.
Yeah, it was one of those ones where that it just was a microcosm of the way the night would finish. And I mean, I don't know about you, but as far as being a young team and just part of me is being a Cleveland fan in the past, just having that waiting for the other foot to drop, just waiting for a collapse or something, and it never happened. So I was kind of excited and thrilled about the outcome of the game.
Do you regularly take your feet off? I'm just curious. The phrase is the shoe drops.
Oh, yeah.
I'm pulling your leg.
Yeah, I don't. No, it was one of those. You're just waiting. I mean, it was a great game, and I mean, I'm sitting there, and I started watching on my phone because we're doing something else, and I was like afraid to move anywhere, afraid to do anything because superstition. Like, all right, if I go and do this, then all of a sudden, it's a stupid superstition, but you never know.
Well, I was sitting there. We're fighting. Tied 29-29 with 1:20 left. And I'm thinking, okay, this is progressing just like the North Carolina game did, right? We're staying neck and neck with them. And then at some point, MSU is going to blow it open. And then we're just never going to be able to catch up again. Only this time the script was reversed and it was the Buckeyes that blew it open. And then it was Michigan State just couldn't keep up, right? Yeah, we even went and made the lead as much as 25 or 27. I can't remember exactly how much. But the flipping of the script in this game against the number 1 team in the nation was such a surprise that normally I have those kinds of superstitious kind of mentality to me, but it never sunk in because I was so shocked by what I was seeing that maybe my brain couldn't fully function because the Buckeyes just kept hitting shots. Even when Michigan State went on their run and looked like they were going to come back, the Buckeyes did the right things. They passed the ball around. They got Keita Bates-D up on the back end for a slam that really slammed the door in MSU's face. And they never really challenged after that, other than Izzo trying desperately to make his team fight a little harder. But that you sort of feel the fight leave them a little bit at that point.
Yeah, I was kind of laughing about how they were sitting there wanting all these fouls called and everything, and I actually thought that Ohio State was playing a lot cleaner of a game than what they were trying to complain about. But, I mean, that's because, obviously I'm biased being an Ohio State fan. But, right. I mean, it just – when you look at Micah Potter, I mean, you and I, we talked about this just between us, but he couldn't get in any kind of rhythm because he definitely was getting into foul trouble. But it seemed like a lot of the shot – I mean, you look at Bates-D, some of the blocks and stuff he had, just clean and just fluid and just – he stuck with it. That one play where it could have been if he didn't continue with the play and blocked a shot, I forget who it was going to the lane, I think, and I don't even think he blocked him or fouled him, but somebody else did, and he blocked a shot, so he wasn't even able to get the ball up into the hoop in order to help get them, some extra points or anything. And it just, I think Bates Diop himself, he took that step forward and became, not just an average player, but a great player right now. I mean, it's so early, but he took that step, in my opinion.
Keita Bates Diop is definitely coming into his own. He's attacking the basket more confidently. He's taking his shot more confidently. He's taking the right shots, right? Early in the season, he was trying to force it. He was trying to put it, in when he really shouldn't, when he should have tried to find one of his teammates for a better shot. Now he's relaxed. He's playing his game. He's letting the game come to him, to use the cliches that are usually tossed around, right? He's making the right plays, and it's just, he's taken off as a player. We're finally seeing the Keita Bates Diop that we've sort of dreamed of seeing for a long time now.
And the other big improvement to his game has been on defense. I mean, he's getting more aggressive, and he's getting a lot better at defense and staying on the court, because he's usually getting himself into a lot of foul trouble, which is limiting him a lot and putting him on the bench. And the Michigan State game, I don't remember how many fouls he had. I mean, the last time I remember, I think he started in the second half with like 2.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the Buckeyes looked like they were in foul trouble in that game. And look, I'm not one to complain about an imbalance of fouling, right? Sometimes one team just plays a cleaner game than the other, but Sparty only having 4 fouls when they at least engaged in 2 moving screens, both of which got Buckeye fouls called, right? I thought that was appalling. Plus, then the Buckeyes engage in a moving screen and they call it on the Buckeyes. So, I don't look for balance in the numbers. I look for balance in the way things are being called. And in the first half of that game, it was clear that the refs were not calling a balanced game. They weren't calling things the same way both ways. But the Bucks did a really good job of adjusting in the second half. And you're right, Keita Bates Diop did a great job of staying out of foul trouble, keeping himself clean so that he could continue to produce for the team when they needed him most, right? He was the linchpin in this game. As much as I've been trying to say that Tate needs to be the one to be the leader, Keita Bates Diop has stepped up the last 2 games and been that leader that we've needed.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, he's been something spectacular. I know, mentioned on Acosta Field with Tony Gerdeman and Tom Ward, that the recipe in order to be able to win these games is stay out of foul trouble and keep your turnovers low. I mean, it's like in football. Your interior line, or the battle of the trenches, is going to win the game, and least turnovers, blah blah blah. But Ohio State had, and I thought it was like 8 or something like that when you and I talked, and you were like, no, it was 6, and I was like, what? And you figure, I mean, C.J. Jackson was averaging almost 6 turnovers a half, and as a team, they only gave up 6 turnovers the whole game. That was huge in itself, and I think it showed I think it showed maturity. I think it showed concentration, and it just the showing of working as a team and coming together, that now that they'll have the confidence going forward as far as, look, we can be a great team.
Right. Absolutely. And, bringing up the turnovers, you comment that C.J. Jackson used to be a big turnover machine. Of the 6 turnovers, no player had more than 1, and C.J. Jackson had a big goose egg. He did not turn the ball over once. So you want to talk about another player who's making strides this season? C.J. Jackson is it. He is coming into his own, playing much better basketball than we've seen earlier in the season. He's taking care of the basketball better. He's rebounding better. He's, dishing the ball better. He's just found his niche in this offense, and he's, it's helping him drain shots, and it's helping him play defense. And as you mentioned earlier, the defense, we really need to mention the defense. The defense did wonders against Michigan State, shutting them down offensively. I have not seen Buckeye defense that good since maybe 2007. Maybe. I'd have to think about it. That was really good defense.
You just gave me chills thinking about Florida.
Yeah, well, there wasn't a whole lot we could do about Florida. That game came down to the fact that we just couldn't hit a 3-pointer to save our lives.
That was just
we were 4 of 24 that game. I mean, that was all lack of exterior shooting. That ball didn't go down, and that was it.
That was all. We'll blame Urban Meyer because he started.
Yeah. Don't remind me.
And also, I mean, let's not discount Cam Williams. His shot is he's not looking as streaky right now. He's looking more consistent, and I think that is a huge upgrade.
Agreed. There's one thing that I would really appreciate Cam Williams do, though, and that is when you make a big play, stop woofing to the crowd and get back on defense. He barely, right out of the second half, he makes this great play, slams the ball, makes sure that Ohio State continues to have the momentum in the second half that they gained at the end of the first. And he starts woofing to the crowd. And Michigan State noticed that, and they jumped on it, drove the ball down the court really fast, and he had to scramble to get back on defense. And luckily, he got there just in the nick of time. But that's the kind of mental breakdown, like the film that we always see of one of the Buckeyes slapping the court, probably was D'Angelo Russell a couple of years ago, slaps the court, and then Nebraska point guard just dribbles around him. Right? We're seeing a lot fewer of those kinds of mental mistakes. We need to be seeing none of those mental mistakes. Now, I'm nitpicking. I mean, we just beat the number 1 team in the nation by 16 points. But that frustrated me so bad.
No, I mean, you're right. And that's something that on the road, you do something like that on the road, and especially in the Big Ten, it could come back to bite you.
Yeah, absolutely. The fans will eat you alive for that. Yeah, no question.
I mean, one of the biggest things that I'm starting to get really concerned about, and he's had this issue throughout his career, and we're only 4 games into the Big Ten season, is Tate's shoulders.
Yeah, I got a little worried when he got spun around by the MSU player.
Yeah, and I mean, it wasn't intentional, but when he grabbed, it kind of reminded me of the Kevin Love and the moron from Boston a few years ago in the playoffs.
Yeah. I was a little surprised that they didn't call a foul, but, it could have been incidental contact, so, I wasn't too upset about it. But still, it's a little concerning that his left shoulder was already hurt before that, and then that play hurt his right shoulder.
Yeah.
Is this something that, are we going to see him come out with 2 taped shoulders tonight against Maryland? I don't know. If we do, that could be a concern. We definitely need Tate on the floor. Okay, he's not producing nearly as much as Keita Bates-Diop, but let's be honest. Who in the Big Ten is producing as much as Keita Bates-Diop right now?
Right.
In fact, his 20 points per game is leading the Big Ten. Who would have thought at the beginning of the season that a Buckeye basketball player would be leading the Big Ten in scoring?
Michigan.
What, they thought Dockich would be the leader? Oh, look, we're giving him to the Buckeyes. He'll go crazy.
Oh, anytime you could throw a Michigan joke and make fun of them, it's always great. I mean, we'll discuss that a little bit here about that game last night or night before if you got to see it. But yeah, before we move on and look forward, we're gonna have Adam Jardy from the Columbus Dispatch join us and talk about what we talked about last week with the recruiting and Thad Matta and all that and the investigative work that he did. We have Adam Jardy from the Columbus Dispatch, the Buckeyes men's basketball beat writer, joining us today on the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network. Adam, how are we doing today?
Hey, I'm doing all right. It's a pleasure to speak with you guys.
Definitely, it's an honor and thrill to have you on board with us today. Last week on our show, we were discussing the article that you had where you did some really good investigative work as far as the looking back at the recruiting in Thad Matta and his assistants, and you noticed that there was a lot of a decline. So we were discussing it, and we had some questions about it, which, by the way, was a really great piece.
Oh, thank you very much. It took a long time to work on.
I believe it. There seemed like probably a lot of data I have to go through.
I could show you the size of my Excel spreadsheet that I had to work on, and it would just probably fry the podcast entirely.
I wouldn't doubt it. One of my biggest questions is, besides the whole Chris Gent issue, which we'll get into, with the news that came out this, I don't know what you want to call it, summer or whatever, about like the Adidas and all that and the pay to play basically. Do you think that had any play in this, or do you think it, with the less recruiting that Thad Matta was doing besides his assistant coaches, was because it's health related?
I think that both of those can be true, and I think both of those to a certain extent are true. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, if you really would get Thad to speak candidly and honestly about all of this, I think he would admit that the health issues were becoming more and more problematic, and it was getting more and more challenging for him to do the things that needed to be done to get out there and to really bring in high-level recruits. I was talking to a recruiting analyst sometime here in the fall. I think it was right around signing day when Ohio State was, when they signed, well, when they got the 4 recruits in the span of like 6 days. I think I was talking to some national recruiting analysts for their thoughts on what Ohio State was doing. And they had made the point to me that, like, during the summer, there was never a moment this summer when they were watching someone and they thought, Ohio State should be here, but they're not here. They said, like, that never happened this summer. Every time they were somewhere and they saw a kid that they thought Ohio State should be recruiting, somebody from that coaching staff was there watching that kid. And so I find that very interesting, because this person had told me that it came in stark contrast to kind of what they've seen the last couple of summers, to where, Ohio State might be, they might have someone really high on their board, but they just weren't out as much as they needed to be to get the kid. So that was kind of a really telling anecdote in my mind as I was kind of going through all this, because I do know to an extent that, and then it's, I guess I shouldn't say no, because it's so hard with all these things. And I've seen coaches that have talked about, it's the job of the reporters to be, telling these stories, to be blowing the lid out. Like, if someone's getting paid to go somewhere, then like, why are people reporting it? Well, it's incredibly difficult to prove any of this stuff, which is why, like, it took the FBI to really dig this stuff out. But I've very much been given the impression that as time went on, I don't believe that Ohio State was all that interested in playing those kinds of games. And I think that they got into situations where they either had commitments or were very close to having commitments, and then when they didn't want to write a check, then they lost guys. And I think that the cumulative effect of that happening over the last couple of years, combined with the physical element, combined with, the not winning as many games, I think it all played a role in eventually just making it harder for them to have the motivation to go out and do this effectively. I think it all played a part.
Now, one of the other questions I had, I know in Acosta Field with Tony Gerdeman, we were talking about one of the issues, or not really issues, but Thad Matta would go to athletic director Gene Smith and say, "Hey, look, this is what it's going to require for this kid. I'm backing off. We don't want to do anything with it." And, after all this news broke, and we were all like, this, great job for what Ohio State did, especially after, all the cloud of the Jim O'Brien and, unfortunately, the Jim Tressel stuff. But the fact that, Thad did great on that end, but on the end of not developing his assistants and having his assistants go out there and help recruit, how much of an issue was that? Especially, when you look at the numbers, how they declined, but in 2015, he had, a top 5 class that came in.
Yeah, that recruiting class continues to be such a strange outlier and everything. And I feel like, and I've had a couple people point out to me since I wrote this story, that, like, that's where the real story is. That's what people want to know, is how in the midst of all this, did they sign a top 5 recruiting class that, by all accounts, was full of guys that should have been able to make impacts. And, I've had people whisper things to me that like, well, it was the best recruiting class they could get without paying. And I mean, I've heard people say things like that, but then like, I mean, you look at nobody still knows why Mickey Mitchell wasn't eligible for the first 10 games or 7 games of his freshman season. Like that's never been disclosed. So like, I don't know what the background is to that story, but I don't know. As far as like building that recruiting class, I mean, it feels like in a lot of ways that recruiting class, even though it's highly ranked, was somewhat of a reactive class to where, like, you end up with Jaquan Lyle because D'Angelo Russell leaves, and you have a need, you need to go get a guy. I mean, I would think that in most scenarios, Thad would not recruit or sign a player like Jaquan, and I don't mean to pile on him, and I don't want to speak too much ill will on him, but I mean, it's a kid that quit the program the summer after his freshman year, quit the program for good his sophomore year. You know, it was just constantly, the more and more you talk to people, it seems like a divisive, presence in that locker room. And, I just don't, he doesn't really fit the mold the more you look at it, of the types of guys that Thad was recruiting when things were going well. And I think you can extend that to most of those guys in that recruiting class, where they might have been highly ranked and they might have been highly prized, but they just didn't really feel like Thad guys, which makes you think that they got to a spot where they just had to take some guys. And in college basketball, more than almost any other sport, if you have a bad recruiting class, it sticks with you for a very long time because the numbers are so small. There's so few guys on the roster that it's really hard to dig yourself out of that hole. So not only did that class really, to a man, underperform as freshmen, but then most of them left. And it just kind of, that made the spiral get worse and worse. As far as like developing his assistant coaches, I don't know. I guess I'm curious how are you trying to quantify that, or can you explain more what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you look at the numbers for Chris Gent. It looked like he did there wasn't any kind of recruiting that he did, and you would think that'd be one of his jobs.
Well, in the data that I have, I requested the information for 5 seasons. It ended up being the last 5 full seasons of Thad Matta's tenure. So all the data that I had, that I compiled, went through the end of the 2015-2016 season, and that was when they hired Chris Jett. So I have data on him for his first 2 seasons, because his first tenure with the coaching staff. So I have, like, he took 7 visits in the 2011-2012 school year, and then in 2012-2013 he took 30 visits. So he was out there, and he was starting to make some inroads on that. I don't have the data for the 1 year that he was back. But so I guess I just don't know, because there is that gap in between where he wasn't on the coaching staff. I'm not sure it ended up not being a full, well, I guess technically it was kind of a full year. Thad got fired in June. So in that last year for Thad, I don't know who was taking how many visits where. But I personally saw Chris Gent at games. I mean, when I went to things around Central Ohio and saw Caleb Weston or saw Dane Goodwin, I saw Chris Gent at some of those games, so I know he had to have been out.
Well, that's good to hear, because I like to apologize to Chris Gent then, because it just, I mean, I thought that I thought he was here for at least 2 seasons. I mean, you're probably right. I just, for some reason, I was thinking it was like 2 seasons, and that's why I didn't see any numbers on there and kind of threw off the bell for me. But I mean, as far as the developing the assistant coaches too, is just as far as with the team and everything, help preparing the team. It just, I mean, was it just like a perfect snowball effect with that 2015 class, and it just rolled downhill and became out of control, or it's just something that you can't put your finger on? I don't know.
Well, for me, it starts. You have to go back further than that, and you have to go back to when things were really rolling. And you think back to the recruiting class with Amir Williams and all those guys, and those were guys that had some talent, but they never really got all that much better. You look at the numbers that some of those guys put up as freshmen and sophomores, and they were the same numbers they were putting up as juniors and seniors. I mean, almost without exception. So you have this recruiting class of guys who not only don't really develop, but aren't good enough to leave. Like, they're not going to the NBA, and they weren't really transferring. So you have this group of guys who then start to sort of change your culture and change the tenor of your program. And then in the context of that Amir Williams class, you have a Mark Loving in your program, and he's going to do what he's going to do, and he's going to be who he is. And so you kind of stack Mark Loving on top of Amir Williams, and then you kind of like this cycle continues to use the snowball analogy. And then you stack Jaquan Lyle and this recruiting class on top of that. It's, to me, you have to trace it back to that Amir Williams class. You have to trace it back to then, from that point on, they kind of start looking at when were guys leaving Ohio, and when were guys, when was Nigel Hayes is going to Wisconsin, and Luke Kennard is going to Duke, and Nick Ward's going to Michigan State, and you start looking at the guys that they didn't keep and the guys they ended up with. It all kind of goes back to right around that time. They took some guys that they probably missed on, and like I said, once you get behind the eight ball in college basketball recruiting, it's just be so hard to dig back out, especially when you have a big class, because once you start dealing with attrition, you just can't get your numbers back to where they need to be, and they're still feeling some of those effects now with this roster.
That's another question that's worth asking. What are the long-term effects from this that you see? Clearly the team looks a lot better than maybe most of us expected, but how far-reaching do you see this maybe having into Coach Holtman's early career?
Well, what's really going to be interesting is when you start looking ahead a little bit, and you start looking at the roster as it stands, and you start looking at who they're recruiting and where their needs are. And I'm pulling up my scholarship list right now as I talk to you guys, because I want to make sure that I have this right in my head. But you look ahead to next season, and there's a gap. You've got from like a guard standpoint, you think you got C.J. Jackson will be a senior, and Musa Jallow will be a sophomore, and then you've got some freshmen. So when you talk about where does a bad recruiting class really hurt you, there's no middle depth there. And for as much as I feel like they have surprised people this season, and for as well as they've played, and for as much as they've gotten out of Keita Bates-Diop, this could be a really, really big, I don't want to say step back, but it could be a really tough season for them next year, because they just flat out don't have guards. And so, if things were different, like next season, you would have Austin Grandstaff would be a senior guard, A.J. Harris would be a senior guard, Jaquan Lyle would be a senior guard, and even Dane Goodwin would be a freshman guard. And who's the other kid? Darius Baisley, but he wasn't a guard. So there are names that just aren't there anymore that create this hole in the middle of your roster. And
the guy you're looking for is Braxton Beverly, by the way.
Braxton Beverly, thank you. I looked at the wrong name there. Yes. So they would have, if guys had stuck around, they would have guards. They would have more depth. But that's really what Chris Holtman is dealing with. And you can't just go out and recruit a 7-man recruiting class. That's just not a reality in college basketball, because you're not going to play 7 guys. You're not going to bring in 7 freshmen. All 7 freshmen are going to play. And the end of that is that maybe you sign 7 kids, and maybe 4 of them transfer because they're not playing enough. So then you're back to square one, because then you're missing 4 kids out of a recruiting class. So what's interesting to me is that he's made a real point. They have 4 guys in this recruiting class. They might add a 5th. If they add a 5th, it's almost certainly going to be a graduate transfer, because that helps you bridge the gap a little bit more, and then you're not putting too many eggs in one recruiting basket, because you just can't afford to do that.
You brought up about missing out in Ohio and how big of an issue that is. Do you see Chris Holtman making Ohio his top priority compared to what Thad was doing?
It's hard for me to specifically compare, because it's so interesting to judge recruiting and how well if you're succeeding or if you're not succeeding. And I know I mentioned Nigel Hayes and Mark Loving, but basically if you would have asked about anybody, and especially anybody in Toledo, which is where I'm from, Mark Loving was a no-brainer. He was a freshman starter at St. John's, which doesn't happen, and was a 4-year starter there. And it's Nigel Hayes is he a football? I saw him play a football game in high school. Is he a football player? Is he a basketball player? He wasn't ranked as highly. They didn't put as much effort into him. He goes to Wisconsin. So I guess you should have probably made a better decision there, better evaluation. But I would say 80% of schools in the country would have made that same pick. They would have taken Mark Loving over Nigel Hayes. So as you start to evaluate how well a school is recruiting, you just don't know until they get on campus and start to develop and start to play. The thing that I can say is that they do understand the importance of keeping kids in Ohio. They're not going to keep all of them in Ohio. And they actually, it was tough for them in this first recruiting class because a lot of schools were able to seize upon the opportunity of coaching change and flip some guys and get some guys to leave the state. So depending on how you look at it in 2018, depending on the ranking, the top 6 kids in Ohio are all going elsewhere. And Ohio State only signed one. It's Justin Aaron's a kid from Versailles who's a 3-star recruit, but I think he's a little better than that. So do you judge that as that was a failure of retaining talent in Ohio? Like, I don't know. I think that it's too early to make those kinds of determinations. But you look ahead, they don't have commitments in 2019 or 2020 or even 2021 yet, but they're making efforts. I mean, they're hosting Ohio kids. They're definitely, when I talk to Ohio coaches, they tell me that Chris Holtman's been around or the coaching staff has been around. And I think they're trying to build those relationships. I think that's literally the kind of thing that only develops over time. But they're not, the final thing I guess I would add to that is that they're not going to just sign an Ohio kid to sign an Ohio kid. And I know that there are going to be I foresee there being times where people are going to be mad because maybe there's only one Ohio kid in the class, or maybe there's a class they don't have any, and people are going to be mad that they didn't get like, oh, here's this, whatever kid from wherever who's a decent prospect or whatever. But like, they're very, very firmly committed to, we are going to sign the players that we think are the best players, regardless of where they're from. Now, we obviously want to recruit Ohio, and we would like them to be from Ohio, but the phrase they always use is that they're looking for Buckeyes. So if those Buckeyes are from Medina or Columbus or Northwood or Cincinnati or, I don't know, Indianapolis or Chicago or D.C., like if they're Buckeyes, those are the guys they're going to look for.
You mentioned Toledo and Ohio State, and I just have flashbacks of Jimmy Jackson.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And, his high school doesn't exist anymore, I believe, which is hard to think about. But, yeah, no, I grew up in a little suburb of Toledo, and actually John Paredes was quite familiar with my suburb. So all the years of covering games and events with John when he was on the beat, we would always reminisce about the Herzl Canning factory that was across the caddy corner from my elementary school, and a lot of good memories of covering things with John and reminiscing about our shared Toledo heritage.
Looking forward to the rest of this year, tomorrow night, or actually, well, this comes out, it'll be tonight, playing Maryland at home. Maryland's, they have a couple of injuries, but they're still not a team to look past. How do you see, are you shocked with a 4-0 start in Big Ten play, and how do you see them finishing out in the Big Ten?
I am absolutely shocked at a 4-0 start in Big Ten play. I think that for the season, when I did my preseason predictions, I either had them at 5-13 or 6-12 overall. So technically, I could still be right, but I think I'm going to be a little bit off the mark on that one. As far as how they finish out, I still, this team's going to hit I feel like a wall at some point, or it's going to hit a rough patch where they're still not operating with a very big margin for error. And I think that when teams actually pressure them, it really creates issues. We saw that. You think back to Iowa, especially the start of the second half. Iowa clawed their way right back into the game because they just started pressuring Ohio State. And even some of the lesser teams on the non-conference schedule did a great job of that. Clemson did a great job of that. And so I think the teams that have really stellar guard play are going to continue to make Ohio State struggle. But having said that, the only team that I've really felt like has really run away with anything in the Big Ten has been Michigan State. Ohio State roundly handled them. So I don't have, at this point, I don't have a projection in my head of how many Big Ten wins I think they're going to end up with. But it just continues to be a surprisingly successful season. I won the website KenPom.com, the advanced statistical analysis website that I probably spend way too much time on. Right now, KenPom has them forecasted to lose 3 games the rest of the season. That would put them 15-3 in the Big Ten after going 7-11 last year, which would clearly make Chris Holtman the Big Ten Coach of the Year, maybe a National Player of the Year. We're just going to have to see how these guys continue to develop, and if Keita Bates-Diop has an off night, how much can the other guys pick up the slack? I mean, you beat Michigan State the way that you did, but Tata had 32. I mean, I don't know how realistic it is that he's going to score half as many points as the other team. So I still have some questions about their ball handling and about their guard depth, but they play hard, and they're getting some of those like weird plays and loose balls to kind of pop their way, things that just have not happened the last couple of years. They've got some good mojo on their side. So, but it'll be interesting. Just like next week, I mean, they go to Rutgers on Sunday, Northwestern on Wednesday, and then they go to New York on Saturday to play Minnesota. And now, none of those games necessarily present like a major red flag, like, oh, this is going to be a really hard game to win. But you are playing 3 games in 7 days in 3 different cities, and those kinds of things. When you look at the schedule and you look at the pace of games, those kinds of things always lead to slip-ups. So there's going to be a game or two still that they lose that we probably think they won't, and they might still be a couple teams we don't think they will.
You mentioned that we've got these 3 road games coming up, but the Buckeyes, at least in the Big Ten, have shown that they're very good at playing on the road within the Big Ten, which has normally been very difficult for most teams, right? The usual refrain we hear is that if you want to get into the NCAA tournament in the Big Ten, you win your home games and you steal a couple of road games. They've already stolen a couple of road games, including one at the Kohl Center, which is one that most Big Ten teams rarely steal. So, I mean, how impressed are you with how they've been playing on the road within the Big Ten, at least?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and you don't even just say they steal one from Wisconsin. That's the worst loss the Badgers had in the history of the Kohl Center. Yep. I mean, they just beat Wisconsin like a drum, and it was stunning. It was to be sitting in that arena and just, I think they hit like their first 7 or 8 3-pointers, and they just shot Wisconsin right out of the building. Yeah, I mean, to start with road wins at Wisconsin and at Iowa, I mean, you're basically playing with house money here. I mean, you got 7 more road games, and if you win 2 of those, finish 4 and 5 on the road in the Big Ten, like pretty much anybody would take that. They've benefited a little bit. I mean, like I said, Wisconsin is down. I mean, their season is rapidly spiraling. I mean, they just stacked road losses to Rutgers and Nebraska back to back, and I mean, I'm not selling anything that Wisconsin, or I'm not buying anything that Wisconsin is selling this year. And I also think that Iowa is not a good team, and that has something to do with some of the success that Ohio State has had, and they don't have to go to Michigan State this year, so that obviously helps. But the point being, if you to win these games, like I said, Wisconsin's down, Iowa's not very good, but I still feel like the teams the last year or two would have found ways to lose these games or make them very interesting. This team didn't do that, so it definitely changes your expectations going forward for how you think they might play. When they go to Penn State or Michigan or Indiana, like those games all look a little bit more winnable because of what we've seen so far.
Now, with that Sparty game the other night, in the second half, you've seen Michigan State starting to make a run. And Ohio State, they kept their heads up and they fought through it. How much of a growth for the team and, a step forward do you think that helped them mentally going forward?
Well, I think that, that was another example of how they've kind of moved on from some of the earlier season issues that they had. I mean, you think back to losing to Butler and losing to Clemson and blowing big leads and how disappointing that was. But to know that, like, you can withstand a run against them, put together by the nation's number 1 team, and you can stem the tide, you can find ways to still win. I mean, I think that certainly helps. That is a big part of their confidence going forward, absolutely.
All right, Adam, we want to thank you for coming on. You want to go ahead and tell our listeners where they can find you at and your stuff?
Yeah, well, you can go to dispatch.com or buckeyeextra.com. That's extra with an X. You can check out all my stuff ends up there, and you can find me on Twitter at Adam Jardy, Jardy for the last name. I try to be as receptive as I can to questions, comments, love mail, love notes, hate notes, whatever you've got. I'm generally pretty accessible, so feel free to reach out.
All right, Eric. Well, that was a great interview and discussion with Adam about the Buckeyes and all that. And I mean, looking forward, we got Maryland. We talked about I mentioned that they got a couple of key injuries, and it's not going to be a walkthrough or anything like that. Having a home court is going to definitely help. You've seen with Michigan State. I mean, Ohio State fans came out, and it was loud. It was, rocking. I'm probably guessing, unfortunately, tonight there's not going to be that great of a crowd because people are looking at them like, oh, Maryland, blah, blah, blah. And when you have number one coming in, that's when you bring everybody out.
Yeah, I understand. But, Maryland has generally been one of the better teams in the Big Ten lately. So, Buckeye fans should absolutely come out. And it's clear that this team responds to the crowd. I mean, the Michigan State game was the best crowd we've had yet. And the players responded to it. They reacted to it. As much as I'm ragging on Cam Williams for woofing to the crowd, he was reacting to the crowd and what the crowd was doing for the team. So, yeah, okay, Maryland may not be the sexiest opponent, but it would be nice to beat them. I got some guys that I work with. I live down in Maryland right now. I got some guys I work with who went to Maryland, and I would appreciate shutting them up.
Yeah, I think that if they come out and I don't want to say lay a goose egg, but if they don't look good and they take the loss, then all the talk that we've been doing about the Michigan State game, about these guys being a, Big Ten tournament, a NCAA tournament team, that it's just going to go out the window.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think it'll bring some question marks again, right? Why were they so good against Michigan State and then maybe not so good against Maryland, which could just come down to matchup, right? Maryland is a little bit more of a balanced team than the Buckeyes are. They might be able to put a little bit more pressure on us with their point guards, as Adam Jardy was discussing in our interview. And that could hurt us even on our own on our home court. But given what Michigan State did to Maryland, I'm not so concerned. Yeah, okay, Team A beats Team B, and then Team B beats Team C, and blah blah blah. Yeah, sure. But the point is, I really think that even if we were to lose to Maryland, Maryland is a very good school, very good basketball school. They've got good players, even with their injuries. They're going to be trying to scramble. They're going to, scratch and claw their way back into the Big Ten fight. They're fifth right now in the Big Ten. They're 3-2, right? A win against the Buckeyes at Ohio State could be the kind of thing that helps them turn their season around and gets them sort of moving in the right direction again. So, I expect them to come out and give us a fight.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. I mean, one of the biggest things is it's Big Ten. You have to be up for all the games. You can't sit back and just relax and rest on, hey, we took out number one. And speaking of taking out number one, I tweeted out after the game, and a lot of people came at me, and it's understandable. I made a comment that, look, Ohio State took out number one, and they didn't storm the court. And then everybody's like, oh, hey, look, they stormed the court. But it was after all, the Michigan State players left the court. Good game, the sportsmanship part of it, allowed the Spartans to get off the court. Then Ohio State fans come onto the court. Is that a rushing the court, or is that a party on the court after a win?
I think you're splitting hairs a little bit. It's also worth pointing out that they waited for Carmen, Ohio to be sung before they ran onto the court. I'll avoid using the vernacular of rushing the court.
Yeah.
6 to 1, half dozen the other, right? It clearly it was not a passionate, holy crap, if you number one, let's get on the court immediately, like we sometimes see in football when
we see it a lot in college basketball though too. It's like
right,
as soon as that buzzer goes,
specifically for the Buckeyes, right?
Oh yeah.
Right. So the Buckeye football fans will storm the field before Carmen, Ohio is even sung, and then there you have all the players standing around with a bunch of fans singing Carmen, Ohio in the field,
and you got
like
Peppers
we saw with Penn State.
You got Peppers punching somebody,
right? And then Jabril Peppers punching someone. Maybe he shouldn't be punching his future fans, but that's okay. Did I open a wound there?
No wounds. No wounds.
Okay.
I hate you.
No, I thought that in terms of a quote unquote court rushing, it was pretty measured, right? Okay, I didn't see how fast the fans came down and whatnot, but you're right. They waited for the Michigan State players to leave the court. They didn't necessarily put anyone in massive harm's way. They were generally respectful to the opponent, and um, again, you're splitting hairs on what you want to call it, but it's different than your typical court rush. It's not the same court rush that we saw when the Buckeyes beat Illinois in 2005. It's not the same field rushes that we see when Buckeyes beat Penn State this year or beat Michigan in 2002, where it was just everybody had to be on the field immediately as soon as the clock hit zero. So yeah, it was a little different.
Now, I will say, as being an employee of Ohio State, working over at the shoe, and you mentioned the Michigan and the Penn State field rushing, which, by the way, if you're stuck in a certain area, you're just like, you're screwed. You're not moving anywhere for a while. But I know that before the game, the red coats, the ushers, everybody, you have a big meeting, safety meeting and everything. You go through everything. And you know that for the employees at the shop before the game, look, number one's here. If we pull off the upset about storming, the court, I seen a lot of people were retweeting to where I think some of the, students and fans were like, hey, they're not, security's keeping us from storming the court. I'll say this again, and I've said it before on different shows. Ohio State is very, very, very dedicated and very concerned about safety. They will take safety above anything else. When you go to storm the field for the Ohio State football games, we know that you're planning on storming the field. All right, we're not going to stop it. I mean, that's why you see all the police standing there around the field goals before, the end of the game, because they're going to go and protect the field goals. And we don't want you guys, jumping over the wall, getting onto the field, but they don't listen. And when they can take the steps down. So, I mean, to sit there and be upset that the security's keeping you off the field, it is a big safety thing. And like I said, when the Tulsa game last year, the storm that came through right at halftime, and they shut all the concession stands down because they, called a stay in place, and because of the lightning around the stadium and everything like that, everybody get into the concourse area. I mean, people are sitting there, hey, you're losing money or whatever. It's not about money. It's not about anything else. It's about safety. And they don't want people getting trampled or, trying to wait in line to get something to eat or something to drink, and other people are trying to get down and be safe or whatever.
Yeah, there's no question that Ohio State has always been worried about fan safety, player safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's no surprise to me. It might be a surprise to some of our listeners, but
all right. I mentioned about the Michigan game. Were you able to watch the Michigan-Purdue game the other night?
No, I did not actually get a chance to watch it. However, my employee, who's a Purdue fan, gave me a pretty good summary of the ending of it.
Yeah, it was funny because we were recording across the field when we got done, and Tony and I were messaging back and forth, and he's like, it's tied, and I hurried up and, turned on the game. And right when the questionable play of the Purdue player knocking the ball out of the Michigan player's hands, I was like, cue Michigan fan crying in 3, 2, 1. I put on Twitter because I just knew, you could tell that the call was going to be overturned, even though it took 10 minutes or whatever. You could just tell. And then I put out a tweet saying, hey, Michigan's going to, Michigan's going to get a foul here, and it's going to cost them the game. They're going to lose the game. Lo and behold, what happened? And Michigan fans are, oh, hey, it's a BS call. No, it's not a BS call. You're in the final seconds of the game. You can't be hooking somebody. You know that they're going to be sitting there looking for anything to call a foul. Don't give them the ammunition. Stop being pure Michigan.
Yeah, and actually in a situation like that, you got to be a little careful because sometimes the refs will anticipate a foul and call a foul when there actually isn't one. So you got to keep your nose really clean in that situation. It's a little unfair, but it is the way the game is played. It is the nature of the beast. if the ref calls the foul, that's generally it, right? They're going to say there was a foul there, whether there was or not. So you got to keep your nose clean in those late game situations, and Michigan didn't do it, right? Purdue goes to the free throw line, they hit their free throws, game over.
Yeah, he just
Tough
made
luck.
one. He made one out of two, and it was smart that he missed the second one, so that way they just had to push the ball up, or the time just kept running. But bottom line, and this is something that Michigan fans don't seem to grasp. Instead of blaming the officials, understand that, and I'm coming at this as being a Browns fan, a Cavs fan, an Indians fan. Don't put yourself in that situation. It wasn't that one play that cost them the game. There was other plays beforehand that led up to that.
Yep. Yeah. God, how's that phrase go? Don't put yourself in a position where the officials decide the game, right? Going back, you can go all the way back to 1974, I think the Olympics was, when the U.S. basketball team's playing Russia, and they had Ukrainian officials. And the Ukrainian officials, of course, were doing everything they could to make sure that Russia won the game. And sure enough, Russia wins the game on a completely BS last play, where they made the U.S. players stand 3 feet away from the inbounds pass. They actually required a 3-foot gap between the two players. They lobbed it down the court and put up a miracle shot, and the rest just didn't give a crap, right? They just let all kinds of shit happen in favor of Russia, right? But the reason why that play occurred was because the United States didn't do what they needed to win the game earlier, right? They let Russia hang around, which then let the officials decide the game, right? At the end of the day, if you're supposed to beat a team, beat the team. Don't give the officials the opportunity. It's that simple, right?
It.
And I'm not saying officials are out to get you. For all the officials who might be listening to this, Chris. But I mean, seriously, officials are human. They're going to make mistakes. Sometimes they'll make a mistake in your favor. Sometimes they won't. Don't give them the chance. That's it.
Look at the Ohio State Penn State football game.
Yeah.
How many bad calls were there against Ohio State? And we could have sat there and said, you know what, the officials cost us that game, but Ohio State clawed their way back into it and came away with the victory. So, I mean, right. You can't be sitting there blaming others for – I mean, look at the Iowa game. We're not going to sit there and say, hey, look, the officials cost us the game or anything like that. The whole team stunk.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was one of those games where the officials really didn't matter, and Iowa did what they needed to just curb stomp us.
I know I've seen some fans sit there and say, well, if Nick Bosa wouldn't have been thrown out, then, that changed the whole complexion of the game. No, it didn't.
It changed the complexion of the game a little bit. I don't think it changed the complexion nearly as much as they like to believe.
Right. Just don't go on Michigan on us.
No, I wasn't planning on it.
No, not you. I'm talking about those fans.
Oh,
when they're sitting there, trying to say that.
Right. No, look, it's okay to say, look, that was a questionable call, right? I have issues with targeting, and I'm not going to go into my dissertation of why targeting is stupid. But just ask yourself whether or not an offensive player ever gets called for targeting, and you know exactly why that rule is completely abysmal. That was a major call, right? Targeting has massive effects on the game, and it can have a game-changing effect. But Nick Bosa is only one player of how many freaking amazing defensive ends does Ohio State have? This year, right?
Mm-hmm.
One player is not going to change the complexion that much. It might be the difference between winning and losing. It's not the difference between a 31-point shellacking and victory. Sorry, I don't think Nick Bosa was going to be enough to save us in that game.
I agree. All right, Buckeye Nation. That's going to do it for this episode of the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network.
Targeting is awful.
Eric, where could our listeners find you on Twitter? So they can hit you up and say, delete your account or something.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sure plenty of them want me to. You can find me at Eric to BBC on Twitter when I'm willing to get on. Just be willing to have a conversation with me and ditch the crazy stuff.
Yeah, no crazy stuff's allowed. I mean, I always enjoy having civil conversations with people. That's always a lot of fun. But when the craziness starts, I'm out.
Yep. Yeah. No kidding.
You can find me on Twitter at Shannon CFB. You could follow the show on Twitter at SILVR Bullets Pod. You can find us on Facebook, Silver Bullets Podcast. We're doing some other stuff on Facebook for the Ozone Radio Network. I'm going to be doing on Twitter. This Facebook kind of made me mad right now, so we'll discuss that another time. Yeah, you can subscribe to our show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, YouTube. We love to hear you guys' feedback, and just hit us up and let us know what you think of the show and everything. And don't forget to listen to the other shows on the network, like newly added show Sloopcast with Jared and Kyle. It's a great show. Take the time and listen to it. It's really good. And then you have Sons of Schmidt with Michael Citro, Mike Meals, and Brandon Zimmerman, which is another great show. And then you have, I guess, that one show, Acosta Field, with Tony Gerdeman and Tom Orr. So,
and please send us your questions.
Yes,
we'd love to answer them.
Send us your questions. You can hit us up with the hashtag AskSilverBullets. And I want to say thanks again for listening, and go Bucks.
Go Bucks.